The classified briefing document arrived sealed in a diplomatic pouch that wasn't supposed to exist. Agent Phoenix had been working in the intelligence community long enough to understand the difference between official channels and the invisible infrastructure that actually ran the government. Official channels were for people who believed that democracy worked the way civics textbooks claimed it worked. The invisible infrastructure was where real power operated, where decisions were made that would shape the course of nations, where human beings were treated as expendable resources in the service of objectives that nobody was supposed to know about. Phoenix had spent 19 years navigating the invisible infrastructure, 19 years of learning how to recognize the subtle signals that indicated which officials were bought and paid for by corporate interests, 19 years of understanding that the intelligence community had essentially become the enforcement arm of multinational corporations masquerading as defenders of national security. If you were about to learn something that would destroy your faith in the institutions you served, would you have the courage to expose it? The document contained a single piece of information: Operation Bloodstone. That was all, just the name. But Phoenix recognized the name. Phoenix had been briefed on Bloodstone 3 months ago during a classified intelligence review. Bloodstone was supposed to be a counterterrorism operation targeting a radical Islamic organization that had been designated as a terrorist threat by the State Department. Bloodstone was supposed to be a defensive operation protecting American lives and American interests. But Phoenix had discovered something during her research. The organization that Bloodstone was targeting hadn't actually committed any terrorist attacks. The organization was a political movement in a small Middle Eastern country that had been threatening to nationalize the oil reserves in their region, reserves that 3 major American oil corporations had contracts to exploit. Bloodstone wasn't a counterterrorism operation. Bloodstone was a corporate military operation designed to destabilize a government that had become inconvenient to American business interests, and it was being executed using American military forces, American intelligence resources, and American tax dollars, all without the knowledge or consent of Congress. Phoenix had tried to report the discrepancy through official channels. She'd submitted a classified memo to her supervisor outlining her concerns about the operation's true objectives. She'd expected the memo to trigger an investigation. She'd expected oversight committees to examine the operation. She'd expected the system to work the way she'd been trained to believe it was supposed to work. Instead, she'd received a phone call from a man who identified himself only as Director Hayes. The call had lasted exactly 90 seconds. Agent Phoenix, we're aware of your concerns about Operation Bloodstone. We've reviewed your memo. We've determined that your interpretation of the data is incorrect. You will cease all independent analysis of Bloodstone. You will not discuss Bloodstone with anyone outside your direct chain of command. You will not mention Bloodstone to any oversight committee. If you violate these instructions, you will be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Do you understand me? Phoenix had understood. She'd understood perfectly. She'd understood that the system didn't work the way she'd been taught. She'd understood that raising concerns about illegal operations didn't trigger oversight, it triggered threats. She'd understood that she'd discovered something that powerful people wanted to keep buried, and those powerful people were now warning her not to dig any deeper. But Phoenix had made a decision that morning, standing in her apartment in Arlington, Virginia, staring at the walls that probably contained surveillance microphones, that she wasn't going to stay silent. She wasn't going to let corporate interests turn American military forces into instruments of economic warfare. She wasn't going to pretend that the intelligence community was serving the national interest when she had evidence that it was serving corporate profit margins. She was going to expose Operation Bloodstone. Consequences be damned. The classified documents began to disappear the moment she accessed them, not physically, digitally. The files that had been available to her on the classified network became restricted. Her access was being systematically revoked. Her security clearance was being quietly downgraded. The institutional machinery was beginning to move against her, silently, inevitably, designed to remove her from the intelligence community before she could cause more damage. Phoenix had maybe 48 hours before she lost access to all classified systems, 48 hours to copy the documents that proved Operation Bloodstone was an illegal corporate military operation, 48 hours to transfer the evidence to someone outside the intelligence community who could publish it, 48 hours to ensure that the truth reached the public before the machinery of government suppressed it completely. She accessed her personal computer, not connected to any government network, not monitored by any intelligence agency. She began the process of transferring the classified documents to encrypted storage. Each document was a potential felony violation of the Espionage Act. Each document was evidence that could result in her being prosecuted for treason. Each document was her insurance policy against being silenced. Would you risk your entire life for the truth, knowing that exposure would cost you everything? By hour 20, Phoenix had secured copies of 437 classified documents. The documents detailed every aspect of Operation Bloodstone, the corporate interests being served, the military forces being deployed, the estimated civilian casualties, the false intelligence justifications that had been created to legitimize the operation. The documents proved that the entire operation had been constructed as a corporate military campaign disguised as counterterrorism. But possessing the documents wasn't enough. Exposure was the only protection against assassination. The only way that Phoenix could survive was if the information became public. The only way the truth could protect her was if thousands of journalists and millions of Americans knew about it. Darkness was the enemy. Sunlight was the only disinfectant. Phoenix made contact with David Chen, an investigative journalist who'd broken major stories about CIA black operations and corporate military corruption. Chen had spent the last 15 years publishing classified information that government officials wished would remain secret. Chen had the credentials, the resources, and most importantly, the courage to publish information that could end his freedom. "I have evidence of an illegal military operation," Phoenix said over an encrypted phone line, "an operation being executed by American military forces under CIA authorization, an operation designed to serve corporate interests, not national security. I can provide you with 437 classified documents proving everything." Chen was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You understand what you're asking me to do. You understand that publishing classified information will trigger a federal investigation. You understand that the government will try to prosecute both of us." "I understand," Phoenix said, "but the alternative is letting this operation proceed. The alternative is letting the military destabilize a government to serve oil corporations. The alternative is complicity." The dead drop was arranged for the following evening in Washington, D.C., in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Phoenix would leave the encrypted drive containing the documents in a specific location. Chen would retrieve it. Within 48 hours, the story would be published. Within 72 hours, Congress would launch an investigation. Within a week, the machinery of government would be forced to acknowledge what Phoenix had exposed. But the machinery of government had already mobilized against her. The intelligence community had determined that Phoenix was a leak. The intelligence community had decided that Phoenix needed to be contained. The intelligence community had activated its protocols for eliminating threats. Phoenix noticed the surveillance on the afternoon before the dead drop. 2 operatives in a parked car across from her apartment. 2 more operatives in the coffee shop where she'd stopped for lunch. The surveillance was obvious, deliberately obvious, designed to let Phoenix know that she was being watched, that her escape routes were being monitored, that her every movement was being tracked. The message was clear. They knew she was about to expose Operation Bloodstone. They were watching her. They were waiting for her to make a mistake. They were going to move in and arrest her the moment she tried to leave the country or the moment she tried to make contact with journalists. Phoenix made her way to the Smithsonian with the knowledge that she was probably walking toward an arrest. The encrypted drive was hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of a book about American history, a book that she casually left on a shelf in the natural history section. Chen would retrieve it. That was the important part. The documents would reach him, the truth would be exposed, and Phoenix would accept whatever consequences followed. She was intercepted in the museum's exit corridor. 2 federal agents, moving with the kind of coordination that suggested real-time surveillance and communication. They had credentials identifying them as FBI. They had a warrant for her arrest on charges of espionage and theft of classified government property. "Agent Phoenix, you're under arrest," one of them said, the words formal and cold. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Phoenix didn't resist. She didn't run. She had done what she needed to do. The documents were in Chen's possession. The story would be published. The truth would reach the American public. Her arrest was irrelevant now. But as they were placing handcuffs on her wrists, Phoenix heard a commotion at the other end of the museum. Shouts, running footsteps, and she realized with absolute clarity that Chen was attempting to retrieve the encrypted drive while the arrest was happening, using the chaos as cover. The federal agents immediately moved toward the commotion. Phoenix was left standing alone in the corridor for approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. She moved in the opposite direction, away from the federal agents, away from the shouting, away from the chaos that Chen had created as a distraction. She made it out of the Smithsonian through a service exit. She moved through Washington, D.C. with the knowledge that her arrest warrant was active. Her face was flagged in every law enforcement database. Her photograph was being circulated to every intelligence agency in the government. She had maybe 6 hours of freedom before the FBI's manhunt closed in around her and made escape impossible. If you were a federal fugitive hunted by the very government you'd served, where would you turn for sanctuary? Phoenix made her way to a safe location that had been prepared months ago, a dead-drop location in Baltimore where she'd stashed a change of clothes, forged documents, and cash. By hour 4, she'd transformed herself into someone completely different. By hour 6, she was on a bus heading south with false identification and a new identity. But her thoughts were occupied with a single question. Had Chen successfully retrieved the documents before being arrested? Had the encrypted drive reached his hands? Was the story about to be published? The answer came through in news reports on a bus station television. David Chen had been arrested attempting to flee the Smithsonian, but the encrypted drive had not been found on him, which meant Chen had successfully hidden it, which meant the documents were safe, which meant the story was going to be published. Phoenix watched the evening news as she sat in a motel room in Richmond, Virginia. She watched as Chen's arrest was announced. She watched as federal prosecutors announced they were pursuing felony charges. She watched as the government began the process of prosecuting a journalist for receiving classified information. But the government's actions had come too late. The next morning, David Chen's publication released the complete Bloodstone documents. The story was published simultaneously in multiple major newspapers. The story was republished on news websites across the country. The story went viral on social media. Within 12 hours, Operation Bloodstone was the headline story in every major news organization in America. Phoenix watched the congressional hearings that were hastily convened. She watched military officials being questioned about an operation they'd claimed didn't exist. She watched corporate executives being asked about contracts they'd claimed were legitimate business operations. She watched the machinery of accountability slowly begin to turn, grinding against the institutional corruption that had been operating in the shadows. But Phoenix remained a fugitive. The government still wanted her prosecuted for espionage. The government still viewed her as a threat. The government still wanted to make an example of her, a warning to other operatives who might consider exposing classified corruption. She lived in hiding for 6 months before she was discovered by immigration authorities in Canada. She was extradited back to the United States to face trial. She was prosecuted on charges of violating the Espionage Act, and she was convicted on all counts, sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. But in the end, Phoenix had won. Operation Bloodstone had been terminated, the military forces had been withdrawn from the region, the oil corporations had been forced to renegotiate their contracts under international scrutiny. And Phoenix's exposure of the operation had inspired other operatives to come forward with evidence of additional corporate military corruption. She had paid an enormous price for telling the truth, but the truth had survived, and that was enough.